All right, glad to have a good number of folks here tonight. Welcome everyone to the Q&A with Rutger Bregman. So I see a lot of familiar faces here, but also some new folks. So to start off with, I wanted to say a few words about Universal Income Project, which is the organization that I run. We are dedicated to increasing conversation around the topic of universal basic income in the United States and California, and aiming to bring in diverse voices. Since basic income is a policy that would affect everyone, it's important to look at it from many different perspectives. So we do that by organizing regular speaker events here in the Bay Area, and like the occasional collaborative grassroots engagement events called the Create-a-thon. We actually just had one last month that some of the folks here participated in. And generally look to build a network that is interested in basic income so that we can get more people thinking, talking, and hopefully supporting it, and be ready for policy pushes in the years ahead. So I want to thank Brigade for hosting us, letting us use their space this evening. So I imagine that most folks here are familiar with basic income as a policy, but in case there are some people who are new to it, I want to say a few words. Universal basic income is a policy that would provide everyone in a country with money every month that's actually sufficient to cover their basic needs. Food, housing, clothing, everything they need to get by. And it's something that's gaining more and more attention over the last few years as possibly a new system that might allow us to, as a society, be much better off than with the safety net and systems that we have today. Opening up more opportunity for people to access entrepreneurship, to provide compensation for unpaid labor, to allow people to move to more flexible employment situations in case our job space continues to become more fragmented and possibly less accessible as technology continues to develop. So I am very excited to have here with me Rutger Bregman, who is a writer and basic income advocate and author of the book Utopia for Realists. We will actually have, people here will have the opportunity to buy copies of the book after the talk, and I think Rutger might even be willing to sign some of those. Rutger has been talking about basic income for a number of years, and most recently, just last week, gave a TED Talk up in Vancouver on the topic, which was quite well received, I hear, amongst the folks there. So very excited to be talking to Rutger today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. And thanks all for coming.
So, to start off with, you've been talking about basic income for a while now. You started writing about it, I think, in 2013, and in 2014 you actually gave a TEDx talk on the topic. What first got you interested in the idea? What brought you to basic income?
Well, that's a funny story, actually. It was pure coincidence. I was already interested in the idea of a radically shorter working week because I was becoming more and more convinced that that was going to be a good solution to a lot of problems. So I was wondering, how can we get people to work less? And then I thought, well, maybe we should just give them money. And at some point, if we give them enough money, they'll probably stop working. So I Googled that, free money experiment, has it ever happened, blah, blah, blah. And then I came across this idea of a basic income, and I suddenly discovered that it's not a very good way to get people to work less. You know, often they do more unpaid or paid work, but that's how I came across the idea and became completely fascinated by it. But it was also because I was convinced for a longer time that we need to think hard about that we need to relearn how to think in utopian terms. That the problem nowadays is not so much that we don't have it good. I mean, we've, especially from a historical perspective, in the past 200 years, we've made tremendous progress. But the problem is that we don't really know where we want to go next. Especially progressives, the modern left, they also know very well what they're against austerity, against growth, against the establishment, against homophobia, against racism. There was even a book published just last year with the title Against Everything by a New York intellectual, and the first chapter of that book was Against Exercise. Now, I'm not saying I'm not against all those things, but you also need to be for something. And a universal basic income is, I believe, one of those very simple ideas that is at the same time not just another policy, but a complete shift in paradigm, how we think about work, how we think about value, and you name it.
So, on the topic of Utopia, your book, Utopia for Realists, you lay out really 3 key pillars within that. Basic income is one, shorter work week, which you just mentioned, is another, and the third is open borders. Can you say a bit about how you see those fitting together?
Sure. I think that the most important thing I try to do in my book is to rethink what work actually is. I believe that a basic income will not only free the poor to decide for themselves what they want to do in their lives. I think I love this phrase, venture capital for the people. I mean, it's just an incredible waste of human potential. For example, child poverty. It's a recent study that shows that it costs about $500 billion each year in terms of higher healthcare spending, higher dropout rates, war crime. And what I try to show in the book is that it's actually cheaper to just completely eradicate poverty. But it will also free the rest of us, or maybe even the rich. Because nowadays, so many people are working jobs that they don't care about, completely meaningless jobs. Or as the anthropologist David Graeber, who has got a very scientific term for it, he calls it bullshit jobs. And a recent poll, for example, in the UK found that as much as 37% of British workers think they have a completely meaningless job. So that's what I also mean with the shorter working week. We need to work less in order to do more, from paid work to unpaid work. So I'm not envisioning a society where we're all watching Netflix and doing nothing. Actually, what's interesting, it's actually the countries with the longer paid work weeks where people watch more television. And it's countries with shorter working weeks where people do more volunteers work, where there's more social capital, people go to, I don't know, the theater more, etc., more high quality ways to spend your time. So that's one thing. And the open borders thing, well, that's probably the most radical idea in my book. It's not really connected to the other ideas. But how it works together with basic income, what I think is that you could have a system where people get gradual access to the welfare state. So first contribute a certain amount in taxes, or be there in a country for a certain amount of years, or pass some language cultural tests. You know, you can do a lot of things, but the most radical thing is to close the borders. And I know that's very fashionable nowadays, but there is a mountain of evidence that immigration is still the most powerful weapon we've got in the fight against global poverty. So I think that more people should have the courage to make that case. And I try to do so in that book.
So last week you gave your TED Talk, and reports are that it had quite the enthusiastic response, a standing ovation at the end. Can you relate any stories about conversations you had, feedback you got that folks might find interesting?
Sure. I was actually a little bit surprised because I was also worried that people wouldn't like the talk because, for example, one of the things I said during the talk is that we should get rid of the vast industry of paternalistic bureaucrats when we can simply hand over their salaries to the poor. And people started clapping. And I was like, but I'm talking about you, you know? So that was funny. And obviously, you know, after a talk, only the people who really liked it come up to you and say, hey, that was interesting. But I mean, it was a fantastic opportunity to. It's really a thing, you know. I started preparing in November, and you work for months and months on something like that. And there was a few days before that. I already arrived there on Friday. I had to give the talk on Tuesday, and you should just imagine that, you know, there are a lot of really rich and famous people in that audience, from, you know, Bill Gates to Richard Branson and all those kind of people. And so there was a workshop managing backstage jitters, and the women who gave that workshop said at the beginning of it, said, "Well, welcome to the Mount Everest of public speaking," and everyone's like, "Oh." So, but well, you can all judge for yourself when the video is online. I have no idea how long that might take, but I'm pushing it to be as soon as possible. But I have no say in it.
And any, either in person or online, people supporting the idea that you wouldn't necessarily have respected?
Well, what's his name? Chris Sacca? He had a lot of followers on Twitter. I didn't know it, not from Europe, but he loved the talk. So, and there was also Bill Gross, the investor, who, yeah, he also emailed me that he was completely convinced. So yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see about it. I really tried. I mean, it was quite a responsibility. I really felt that. I mean, there are so many people doing great work on universal basic income right now, so I didn't want to mess it up. And I decided to start with just the basic income guarantee, because that's, in my mind, that's the umbrella concept in which both the negative income tax and the universal basic income fits in. And most of my book is about whether is about the experiments that happened in the 70s, which were like a negative income tax. And I talked about research that shows that poverty is not a lack of character, but poverty is a lack of cash, and that we need to completely update our assumptions about poverty. So I think, I hope it will be a talk that will get people interested in the subject. I mean, that's the only thing you can hope for. I mean, just to make people curious.
So over the last 2 years, there's been a surge of interest in basic income.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to early 2015, next to no one was talking about it. Suddenly it's popping up in the media.
Yeah.
You have high-profile folks who are starting to get excited. There's a new organization, there's new pilots, there's high-profile supporters. Which developments have excited you the most in this space?
Well, a lot. I mean, I started writing about this in 2013, and it was very lonely back then. For example, I did a lot of research on the Canadian experiment that happened in the 70s, and I had to rely on the most obscure sources, you know, from local Canadian newspapers from back then. And now, if you Google that, you know, there's a great Wikipedia page on it, and there's a lot of information out there now. So it's just been incredible to see how quickly this idea is spreading. Let me give you one example. I've got one story in the book about an experiment they did in London in 2009. There were 13 homeless men living on the streets there, some of them for 40 years, and they decided, well, let's try something new. Let's just give them cash, £3,000, and let's see what happens. Now, many people obviously thought it was crazy, but they had already tried so much that it was time for something crazy. A year after the experiment, 7 out of 13 of the men had a roof above their head, 2 more had applied for housing, and it turned out that they had saved a lot of money. Even The Economist at that point said, well, if you want to spend cash on the homeless, it's probably best just to give it to them. Because, I mean, people living on the streets, police costs, healthcare costs, is way more expensive. Now, what happened is that an older Dutch woman read my book in original Dutch, and she sent it to her son, who sent it to another friend who lives in Vancouver, and he read it while traveling there. And he gave it to another friend, and she was doing a bullshit job in marketing and getting really depressed, and she thought, you know, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to do something really valuable. I want to do a study like that in Vancouver. So just last week they got $500,000 in government funding to start the first big study of its kind on giving cash to the homeless. Now, that's the kind of things that, I mean, I find that so heartening, so fascinating, is that it really shows the power of ideas, right? It really matters. It's just, you don't know. When you say something, when I say something to you, you say it to the next person, etc. And that's how these things work. So, and yeah, it's been quite exciting to see how quickly that can go in just 5 years.
So we talked a little bit about the potential benefits that basic income would have, and I would expect most people in this room are supporters of policy. But even if you support it, there may still be reservations. So I'm curious, are there any aspects of basic income that you have concerns about?
Well, I think that every good idea can be hijacked. And that's something that you always need to be wary about. So if suddenly everyone is in favor from the left to the right for a certain idea, I mean, the first probable right reaction is to be a little skeptical. You know, what is going on here? Are they talking about the same thing? For example, there are a lot of libertarians in the US. Charles Murray, for example, wrote a book about a form of basic income, and he wants to get rid of Medicare and Medicaid as well. Now, maybe that's my European perspective, but that sounds just completely ludicrous to me. I mean, I think that every sane society should have universal healthcare, and I really see a basic income as a supplement to that. So you need proper public education, you need universal healthcare, and a universal basic income. Now, what you can get rid of is obviously all the workfare policies and all the conditionalities in our benefit systems, etc. Sure, there are some policies that you can get rid of. So I think it's important to think about that and not just, and it's important to think about strategy, you know. You need, there are different roles to play in this movement. So you need people with this utopian vision who can get the idea out, but you also need the tinkerers. You also need policy-minded people who really get into the nitty-gritty, you know, think about what's the first pragmatic step that we can take tomorrow to take a step in the direction we want to go. I think that's important. And I'm sometimes worried that that we're not thinking enough about that, about the strategic issues of how we can get there.
So you wrote Utopia for Realists.
Mm-hmm.
You just gave a TED Talk. What's next?
Well, I wrote about a 15-hour work week, so I should probably retire now. No, I'm actually writing a new book. So yeah, that's what I love to do most. And the new book is, I think, going to be about human nature. So a lot of people watch the news, obviously, and if you watch the news, at the end of the day, you probably have a very bleak image of human nature. You'll probably have the feeling that most people are corrupt and want to rig the system, etc. This is actually, I think, one of the reasons why many people are skeptical of basic income, is that they simply watch too much of the news. While my idea is that most people are pretty nice, and this is what we find also in a lot of scientific experiments. So I want to go over all the old experiments and stories from the 60s, for example, the famous Milgram experiment, or the Stanford prison experiment, or I was just writing an essay about Lord of the Flies, you know, all the kids on the island, and I'm trying to debunk all those myths that in the end we're not as bad as we think we are. So that sort of fits with my thinking about basic income as well, because I think that underlying the idea of a basic income is also a completely different image of human nature. It's that most people want to make something of their lives. Most people are creative, want to get up in the morning and do something. But the problem is that nowadays millions of people are either stuck in bullshit jobs or in bullshit jobs or in poverty. And a basic income will free them.
All right, so we have time for some questions from the audience. You want to ask something? Let you go over there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, and thanks for having this event. Thanks for being here. I'm a newbie in the universal income policy space, so I appreciate the conversation. You described it at the start of your remarks as really a paradigm shift, and I wonder if there's what historical precedent you think of as being, when was the last time there was a paradigm shift anywhere close to this? And your reflection on that are probably useful for the sort of strategic thinking that you said needs to happen. Right? So if you,
that's a great question. I think it's important to remember that every milestone of civilization, the end of slavery, or democracy, or equal rights for men and women, or the rise of the modern welfare state, you know, all these developments and ideas were completely ludicrous utopian ones. So it always starts there. And what we also know is that real change doesn't start in places like Washington or Westminster or The Hague, the political center of Holland, where I live. It always starts in places like this, you know, at the fringes, where people are trying to push for new ideas. In the epilogue of my book, I tell the story of a political scientist, Joseph Overton, who was actually a very right-wing libertarian. And he had this idea of a window. And in that window are all the policies and ideas which are seen as acceptable, reasonable, you know, that mainstream journalists want to talk about, that are considered in Washington. And most people stick to that window. They think that if you want to change the world, you gotta at least be in the window, because otherwise people won't take you seriously. But Joseph Overton's idea was that no, if you really want to change the world, you gotta move the window. You just got to make the unreasonable reasonable. You got to make the unrealistic inevitable. Now, how do you do that? You don't do it by staying in the center, but you do it by pushing at the margins, by the fringes. Now, who's been really good at that? Donald Trump. I mean, he's the greatest utopian thinker of our time. He's really good at it. It's just, I mean, it's not my utopia, but that's how real change works, I think. And the problem with so many of the progressives or the left is that they're just not doing that. They're either moving in the direction of their opponents, or they don't have the courage to really push in the other direction, or they're, I don't know, longing for a pass or something like that. And that's what really excites me about basic income. It's really a new idea. It moves beyond old-fashioned political thinking between the left and the right, and it's also really about a different way of organizing a society and living our lives. So, yeah, especially if you're young, be as unreasonable and unrealistic as possible. That's really important.
So I've been in this space for quite a while, and one of the big pushbacks that I get is the idea that work is dignity, and that if you just leave people, give them money, you're robbing them of dignity.
Another great question. Well, I hear that argument a lot from rich white guys who say that people get a lot of dignity from some crappy Walmart job or something. Well, I'm a little bit skeptical about, especially, I mean, again, from a European perspective, I see so many jobs around here that don't need to exist. You know, some people at a supermarket saying hi to me or whatever. You know, that's a job that doesn't need to exist. Why is it there? I think that, and this also, there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley right now who say that, you know, jobs are going to take, or robots are going to take all our jobs, and it's going to be a big problem. Well, I think we should never underestimate capitalism's extraordinary ability to come up with new bullshit jobs. I mean, that could go on and on and on. So what we should do is redefine work. And you can find dignity in paid work, but also in unpaid work. I mean, caring for our kids, caring for our elderly, volunteers work. I think it's incredibly paternalistic to say that the only way that people can find dignity is in paid work, in a hierarchical relationship with their employer, and that's the only way to live a meaningful life. That'd be really sad if we have to live our life like that for the coming centuries. I think that the real challenge of the future, and this is also what many of the greatest thinkers in the 20th century were thinking about, you know, the great challenge would be boredom, according to them. You know, what are we going to do when the machines have taken all our jobs? Well, that's the question we should be asking. And the thing is, education would be completely different. Nowadays, education is about preparing people as soon as possible for a high-paying job that people don't care about. Well, maybe education should prepare you for a life well lived. You know, maybe that should be the purpose of it. But I'm pretty confident that we can do it. I mean, we're a pretty creative species as well.
What about Derek?
Thanks, guys. It was a great talk. My name is Vakas. Actually, my startup worked with craftsmen in Pakistan, where I grew up and I was born. I have one comment and one question. So my comment on dignity is actually, dignity is not like having basic free income. Dignity is actually having the freedom to do whatever you want to do. Most people who are living less than basic universal income, they don't have enough money to make any choice. So they don't have dignity because they don't have freedom. It's not the money, it's the freedom. My question is, in your opinion, what are the nations that will lead the universal basic income? Is it going to be the US or a country like somewhere in Europe, or maybe a developing country where maybe it's cheaper to give basic universal income to everyone? And the other thing is, like in countries like Pakistan and India, some of our politicians and leaders are trying to follow the footsteps of US and Canada and Japan. Should they try to get everyone crappy jobs and then like move to something which US is trying to get, or they should like directly aim for what eventually US should get as well?
Well, actually, basic income is a very promising idea for developing countries as well, and it's not a coincidence that also at the political level, people in India are getting really interested, because there are like hundreds and hundreds of anti-poverty programs that don't reach the poor, because there are a lot of corrupt officials, in between, and the assistance in the end doesn't receive the poor. Now, there have been a lot of great technological breakthroughs, especially mobile money. Give Directly, the NGO, is already working with that, giving direct cash to poor people in Uganda or in Kenya, and it works really, really well. Now, you could also do that in governments could also do that, and actually, they're already doing it. So in the past 20 years, we've seen a huge revolution in cash transfer programs. Now, most of these programs are conditional, but with pretty small conditions, like you got to send your kids to school or vaccinate them or something like that. And these programs are incredibly effective at alleviating poverty. So yes, I think it's a very promising idea for the developing world as well. Now, I get the question a lot: will this happen earlier in Europe or in Finland, or in the US? Then I always tell the story that it was actually Richard Nixon who proposed the model of basic income, got it through the House of Representatives twice, and it was only killed in the left because the Democrats wanted a higher basic income guarantee. So actually, a big part of my book is about the US. The US has a much richer history when it comes to thinking about basic income, experimenting with basic income, than most countries in Europe. And you shouldn't forget that Europe also has a very strong social democratic tradition. And the social democrats, they are paternalists. They want to help the poor, but on their terms. They don't trust the poor to make their own decisions. While in the US, there is a much stronger libertarian tradition that cares about freedom and about people making their own choices. So what I try to do in the book, actually, and also in my talks, is to use a more conservative right-wing language to defend progressive ideals. We should use all those words like progress, venture capital for the people, efficiency, freedom, getting rid of the nanny state, etc., and use them to defend an idea like universal basic income. There's a part of the population that thinks in terms of caring. We need to care for these poor people, we need to help them, etc., etc. But most people don't like that. Especially many with lower incomes. You attack their dignity in that way. I think that especially people on the left or progressives should really think hard about the language they're using when they're defending these kind of proposals.
There's also Canada, which Ontario has a pilot program right now, and their Liberal Party, which is in power, actually has basic income as part of their platform. So
Canada is probably the first country most likely to get there. They've announced a huge experiment just last week. 4,000 people will participate in it.
Yeah.
And actually, Justin Trudeau's wife ordered my book a few months ago. So.
Thank you again. My name is Michael. I had a question actually quite related to that, but thinking more in the present. So I went to a talk with Sam Altman at the Commonwealth Club talking about Y Combinator's program here. And so I guess really just continuing on that same thread, who do you think is developing the most promising programs right now? Like the system that you were just talking about in Canada, and I guess more specifically, what makes a well-scoped trial right now?
Well, let me be honest here. I think that all the experiments are especially great at raising awareness to get more and more people interested in it. When it comes to what we can learn from them, I think we already have a lot of evidence. There have already been a lot of experiments. One fascinating natural experiment in North Carolina. Sure, we could also use more evidence, but I think that I already pretty much know what the result is going to be. So people don't stop working, healthcare costs go down, crime goes down a little bit, kids perform better in school. It's pretty predictable what's going to happen. But the thing is, we'll never know what a real basic income looks like until we implement it on a national level. Because the most important effect of a basic income would be not just about the redistribution of income, but about the redistribution of power. So just imagine, if you are a garbage collector right now, or a nurse, or a teacher, You like your job, you think it's important, but you're not really happy with your wage maybe. So you can say to your employer, look, I'm perfectly willing to continue doing my job, but I can always fall back on my basic income. So you have to pay me a higher wage. So those wages will go up. Now, just imagine you're in some bullshit job. You know, you won't get any additional bargaining power. So what I think will happen with the basic income is that wages will much better reflect the social value of those jobs. And that will make, you know, our whole market very different. And you won't see those effects in the experiments. Because, you know, if you give a basic income to 5,000 people in a labor market of 10 million or 100 million or 200 million, that's not going to change much. Although I must mention that in the dolphin experiment in 1974, that was such a close community that you did see the effect there, that wages did go up for people with important low-paying jobs. But that's actually, I think I'm personally most excited about that effect, because I mean, in the economies and societies we're living in right now, it's completely ludicrous. I mean, people on Wall Street actually destroying wealth are getting richer and richer, while people doing the real valuable work, you know, if they go on strike, it'd be a disaster, and they're not earning a lot. So I'm most excited about that effect.
I would add, as someone working to increase the level of conversation, I think when you have pilots where stories can come out of them, and you can actually get these anecdotes and see how people's lives are changed, that can be hugely valuable, because so much of the barriers that we face around basic income are simply this idea that it's somehow unnatural, it somehow is counter to our work ethic, it somehow isn't going to work. And if you can give people these clear examples and stories of how it does work, that can make a big difference in convincing people.
There's one danger though, and that was also we know from the history of basic income in 1978, there were huge experiments going on in the US as well. And what they found out in 1978 in the Seattle experiment is that the divorce rate had gone up by 50%. So at that point, all the conservatives said, look, funny idea, basic income, but we can't have this. I mean, this will make women much too independent. Yeah, at that point they didn't want to hear anything about basic income anymore. It was only 10 years later that they found out that a statistical mistake had been made. And in reality, the divorce rate did not go up. But at that point, we had already arrived in the era of Reaganomics, etc. So it's also important to think about how these experiments are going to be framed. Because that also happened in the US experiments, is that there was actually a very small decline in working hours, but in the media it was presented as, you know, people are just completely lazy and stop working, which was not true at all, because every time they worked a little bit less, and nowadays researchers think that even didn't happen, but even if they worked a little bit less, they did more unpaid work, volunteers work, or whatever. But it's really, it's important to be cautious around that, because in the 70s, especially in the stories that some people were telling about those experiments didn't really help.
Hi. Good question.
So 2 questions. One, if universal basic income was implemented next year in the US, what do you think would be a realistic annual income? And my second question is, on a national level, where would the funds come from? Would there be different kinds of taxation? Would there be an income tax?
I think we've just been talking about that. There are 2 forms of a basic income guarantee. The most talked about form is a universal basic income, which means that everyone would receive a monthly grant. Bill Gates gets it, and homeless people, everyone gets it. Another way to get a basic income guarantee is through what we call a negative income tax. And this means that your income is topped up as soon as you fall below the poverty line. It's a bit like the earned income tax credit, but then also if you don't have a job, so everyone would get it. I think that politically it's probably easier to get a basic income guarantee in that way, although I think the idea of a universal basic income is just, well, it's more utopian and more attractive to me, but it's also seems to be more for the long term. Now, however we do it, it's got to be enough to get you above the poverty line. Where a lot of confusion comes in is when we start talking about the costs. especially when it comes to universal basic income. So people say, oh, there are this and that many inhabitants in that country, and then you give like $10,000 a year, and this will cost trillions of dollars. We can't pay for it. But you got to remember that a lot of people will receive a basic income, but pay the same amount in additional taxes. You know, it's got to be funded. So it's really important to look at the net redistribution that will be going on, and that's actually a lot smaller. So, for example, one of the biggest group that obviously would benefit from a basic income are the poor, and we'll have to get a net redistribution towards them, right? Now, how much would it cost to get all the poor in the US above the poverty line? Not much, actually. 175 billion, quarter of the US military budget, 1% of GDP. So, if you look at the net redistribution, you don't need a lot or like a bizarre amount of additional funds. Now, how could you fund it? A lot of ideas. I mean, there are like 100 ideas out there. I really like the idea of using, I don't know, natural resources or a carbon tax or those kind of things, because then you can say, well, this is just a dividend of progress or a dividend of, you know, it's just a right simply because you exist. But probably you also would need to fund part of it through the income tax. And then that may have to rise for certain groups, which is probably, especially in this country, a good idea, since inequality has reached completely crazy levels. But I think it's also important to remember when it comes to the costs, is we need to keep making the case that this is an investment that I believe that, especially in the long run, will pay for itself. You know, I just said 175 billion to eradicate poverty. The cost of just child poverty is 500 billion. You know, we're paying through the nose for all that waste of human potential right now. We are living in an era of politics right now that people are thinking only in zero-sum terms. You know, you win, I lose. Donald Trump is the greatest example of that. You know, you win, I lose, etc. I think we should think in win-win terms. That's what the whole Project of Progress has been about since the Enlightenment, and there are so many examples of that. That if we invest in each other, in the end, we're all better off.
All right, one more question. Right here.
Mine is really quick. So, pretend this is not a room in San Francisco and a room in Alabama, and you were giving just an elevator pitch for UBI, using some of those terms that you were talking about, that framing. I wonder if you can give us a little elevator pitch, as though we're a room in Alabama.
That's a great question. I think I should write a piece about that and then really try to make a YouTube video out of it or something, because I think it can be done. I think that you could do, like, use Fox News language to defend the basic income. What I would probably start with is you could really start with showing how incredibly paternalistic our current welfare policies are right now, and how much money is being wasted there. And you could start by showing that there is so much important work being done by people who are not being paid, you know, caring for our kids, caring for our elderly, volunteers work, etc., etc. And while at the same time there's a lot of work that's very well paid in Wall Street or in Silicon Valley, you know, people are trying to let us click on as much ads as possible. That's not very useful. So you gotta talk about the real economy. In the book, I've got one example of what happens when people go on strike. Now, when garbage collectors go on strike, I've got the example of New York 1968, and it's a complete disaster. You know, these people are doing really important work. After 6 days, the emergency state has to be declared. And then I wondered, has it ever happened that the bankers went on strike? And I found only one example in all of world history. It was Ireland 1970. That strike lasted for 6 months and nothing much happened. You know, the economy just kept growing and there was no problem at all. So with that kind of examples, I could show that we need to completely rethink who's adding the real value here, who are really like the strong shoulders that we are all depending on, and that those people, they deserve a basic income. I would probably try it in that way. Use the language of work, use the language of anti-paternalism, etc., to defend a policy like that. I think it can be done.
All right, well, thank you again, Rutger.
Thank you.